sure you all know about the 1994 elections in South Africa, where Nelson Mandela was famously elected as president, and the non-white majority gained equal rights, and the country put an end to the apartheid policy. But how many of you know the reasons why South Africa changed its ways, and what caused the apartheid policy to eventually be dismantled? I want to thank you all for being here. My name is Charlotte, and I work together with my colleagues to discuss the business leaders' role in the South Africa historic transition from apartheid to democracy. So to start with, what was apartheid? The apartheid was a policy of racial separatism enforced by the South African government between 1948 and 1991. This involved political, legal, and economic discrimination against the population defined as non-white, and favored the less than 10% minority defined as white. This separation between races included enacted laws such as population registration based on race, prohibition of mixed marriages, and restrictions concerning the right to vote and own property, as well as residential areas being restricted based upon race, and it was even forbidden for the native South Africans to start businesses and own property outside of these restricted areas. Many people acted to end the apartheid. The anti-apartheid group African National Congress, ANC, with Nelson Mandela as leader, became the most influenced power. Their opposition contained mostly of legal tactics and non-violent actions. But the road to democratic South Africa was filled with years of protest, demonstrations, and violence. The apartheid system may have been built to favor the white minority, but in the end, its reliance upon what non-white manpower increased and isolated South Africa from the rest of the world. In protest against the South Africa's apartheid policy, more than 350 corporations, with at least 200 being American, divested from the South African market. And this resulted in the country being in an economic state of isolation from the rest of the world, who were participating in a global economy. Consequently, this created pressure on business leaders both inside and outside of South Africa to evaluate if it was still profitable for the companies to keep its interests within South Africa. And they also had to consider if their own ethical and moral standpoint on the matter. I would now like to give the word to my colleagues, Carl and Sam from Jönköping University, to enlighten us on how the business leaders responded to the apartheid policy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, how did business leaders react to this? Many companies had implemented the Sullivan Principle to their businesses, which held the company to treat all of their employees as equals, with the same right both at work and outside. For General Motors, for whom Dr. Sullivan, the creator of the Sullivan Principle, were a board member, this posed a problem. As the largest employer of native South Africans, they faced a dilemma to either abandon the principle and themselves divest from the country, or face the economic threat of divestment. Not only companies in South Africa stood in front of the threat of divestment. Another large player were colleges and universities. The youth who had grown up in a more tolerant society pushed for institutions to adhere to the Sullivan Principle as well, and divest the companies operating in South Africa. Since they couldn't use divestment against the institutions, they instead arranged protest rallies and signed petitions. This leads up to the questions of how effective were the actions of the business leaders.
Well, one of the biggest influences on South Africa's journey towards national reconciliation was the economic sanctions placed on them by the US. More than 21 states abided to this, and all companies and individuals had to withdraw investment from South Africa. So firstly, due to capital flight, it meant that there was not enough money in the country to finance their own domestic investment, consequently leading to a decrease in economic activity. Secondly, with the lack of investment, the government's revenues were at an all-time low, meaning that they were unable to pay back the debt owed to foreign countries. And lastly, as the government's revenue falls, it meant that they were forced to borrow increasing sums of money from abroad, resulting in an increase in foreign debt burden. So, what did they do to try to get rid of this debt?
Well, due to the South Africans borrowing more and more capital from foreign countries, there was this continuous level of debt looming over them. This eventually led to the apartheid government towards international isolation, leaving them no choice but to borrow large sums of money for investments such as the Sasol project. The Sasol project was an idea to make use of South Africa's natural resources and turn coal into oil, in order to try and increase the capital formation once again. Shortly after this, in 1986, an attempt was made to repay the debts, which ended in a reduction of capital flight. But was this enough to save South Africa?
Well, as good as the reducing the capital flight was, when investors were forced to sell their shares, they did so cheaply to local South African white businessmen, arguably making the sanctions put in place to abolish the apartheid policy, only making the white minority even wealthier. Unfortunately, by doing this, it left even less power to the black people, and that means the white minority were able to control most of the economic activity. One of the large underlying problems was that South Africa has a superb industrial base, as well as vast mineral resources, which many countries, including France, Denmark, and many countries in Africa required, with many of these valuable resources being precious metals, diamonds, coal and oil. Even if all foreign trade were to cease, South Africa could still internally create more than enough capital and build infrastructure from their natural resources despite the lack of foreign investment. Even so, the rest of the world sorely needs their minerals and resources. So despite the sanctions put in place, South Africa were in fact still trading with many countries, including Far Eastern markets, and were even exporting arms to 23 countries, effectively showing that sanctions did not have as much of an influence on South Africa as we might think.
With such a successful vehicle for political change, could the Business Leaders Act take a similar role elsewhere? I would like to invite Araya up to discuss her research on this matter.
Hello. When examining the impact of the Foreign Business Leaders Action on South Africa, I wonder if these same actions may have a similar role elsewhere. Comparatively, the same catalytic actions that business leaders took in South Africa are also occurring present day in the United States. The current issue at hand is the ramifications of the fossil fuel industry and many firms' ethically ambiguous investments within the industry. Much like the student protests during the apartheid era, there are similar protests today demanding companies and public institutions divest their shares from the oil companies. Divestment activists are demanding that the industry be liable for their role in the environmental crisis and are warning that investing in oil companies does not have a projected high return. By shifting public support and capital away from the industry and guiding it towards a renewable energy, which is hoped to dismantle its presence within the U.S. economy. One way that divesting may create widespread political change is by constructing tension around city pension systems. For example, the current fossil-free movement has already had political effects in New York City. As reported by New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, New York plans to divest $5 billion from oil companies. New York City is standing up for future generations by becoming the first major U.S. city to divest our pensions from fossil fuels. Paul Tudor Jones, who is a partner of Goldman Sachs and part of a notable Wall Street divestment, stated, "Capitalism should be a positive force for change. I feel this exemplifies the divestment movement." Considering the divestment movement as an evolving process, it has an adept impact already and is in the process of affecting more legislative changes. Now I would like to invite my colleagues up to discuss our conclusion.
Thank you.
So, through our presentation today, we have come to the conclusion that the business leaders played an immense role in pressuring the South African government to end the apartheid. The factors that caused the business leaders to act were both internal and external. Examples of this include the Solomon Principle, civilian protest, divestment targeting against companies operating in South Africa, and the sanctions limiting export and import trade. The sanctions required individuals and companies to withdraw all of their investment from businesses within South Africa. Unfortunately, this meant selling all of their shares cheaply off to the white local business owners, resulting in them having even more power and money than they did before.
Besides this, South Africa still has a great variety of natural resources, which are in high demand from the rest of the world. So despite the sanctions, it was near impossible to cut off all trade with them. To conclude, even with the sanctions in place by themselves, it was not enough to end the apartheid policy. In the end, it was not the governments who had the largest impact in the apartheid.
That power lied in the hands of the people who used their unified economic power to force companies to adhere to the moral policies of the masses, thereby hurting South African economy from the inside, which was much more effective than imposing sanctions. This forced South African political leaders to eventually abolish apartheid in order to avoid huge losses in trade, jobs and alliances.
What transpired in South Africa can happen anywhere. Since we live in a world with a global economy, no country can preserve or increase itself if a selection of firms unite in refusing to trade or invest. In today's global ethos, you can't help but notice how the events transpiring in the United States fossil fuel divestment movement parallels the apartheid era. Even though the fossil fuel crisis is a very different situation from the South African apartheid, business leaders have, through divestment, created political change. The business leaders' role in the apartheid demonstrates how actions can be made to push politics and create change.
Thank you for listening.